You're listening to the free ad-sponsored re-release of American Election's Wicked Game, a weekly march through every presidential election from 1789 to 2024. To listen to all episodes right now, ad-free, go to intohistory.com. Subscribers there enjoy ad-free listening, early access, bonus content, and more from a growing collection of great history podcasts. Start your free trial today at intohistory.com. It's Friday, August 23rd, 1968, at the Civic Center Plaza in Chicago, Illinois. Members of the Youth Political Party, or Yippies as they're called, have gathered in downtown Chicago for a week of demonstrations leading up to the 1968 Democratic National Convention. The Yippies have come to protest the Vietnam War and the Democratic establishment. Moderate Democratic Party leaders have been pushing the candidacy of Vice President Hubert Humphrey, but the Yippies have gathered here in Civic Center Plaza to put forward a candidate of their own. The crowd cheers as Jerry Rubin, the leader of the Yippies, stands by the Picasso sculpture in Civic Center Plaza and makes a speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, and everyone in between, I have an announcement to make.
What is it?
Well, stop interrupting and I'll tell you. As you all know, we're gathered here to protest the criminal, immoral occupation of Vietnam by the American war machine. And we're here to protest that same war machine's assault on our black brothers and sisters here at home. But as you also know, there's something else very important happening this week.
Cubs are playing the Astros tonight.
Yes, very important, but not that. I'm sure you're all aware of a little thing called the Democratic National Convention. Well, this coming week, the Democratic Party is going to choose their nominee for this year's election. That's why we've got all these police around downtown, to make sure nobody on the outside pulls any funny business. Well, if funny business is what they're worried about, funny business is what they're gonna get.
With a grand gesture, Rubin steps over to the side as a small group of his fellow Yippies make their way through the crowd.
Ladies, gentlemen, Yippies, I hereby nominate Pegasus J. Pig.
The small group unveils a large black and brown pig and holds him up for the crowd to see.
Mr. Pig's platform includes an end to the Vietnam War, and he promises that should he win the presidency, he'll be eaten, which is the opposite of the usual state of affairs in which the winner eats the people.
Then Rubin pulls out a folded piece of paper.
And now to read some opening remarks for Mr. Pig. I, Pegasus, hereby announce my candidacy for the presidency of the United States.
But before Rubin can finish the speech, uniformed police officers suddenly burst onto the scene. The crowd shouts and boos as the officers grab Rubin and his compatriots and toss them in the back of a police van. Pegasus squeals as two officers hoist him up and carry him to the back of the van where the police captain is waiting.
What should we do with the pig, sir?
Rubin calls out from the back of the paddy wagon.
Have a heart, Captain. You wouldn't arrest one of your own, would you?
Shut it, Rubin. Chicago PD's had just about enough of you long hairs.
Boys, throw the pig in with him. Yes, sir.
You're all going to jail, and you can thank your friend here, because he squealed on you. Pegasus J. Pig did not receive the Democratic nomination. Neither did the other anti-war candidate, Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota. Instead, the nomination went to Vice President Hubert Humphrey. This angered the young and politically radical members of the Democratic Party. For one thing, Humphrey's platform meant the continuation of the Vietnam War. And for another, unlike Senator McCarthy, Vice President Humphrey had barely campaigned. His nomination was shoved through by party bosses, not the people. The Yippies' nomination of Pegasus on August 23rd was a peaceful protest, an act of political theater. But in the days leading up to the 1968 convention, thousands of anti-war protesters, police officers, and National Guardsmen flooded the streets. Tear gas was deployed, innocent bystanders injured. One young man was shot to death by the police. Protesters were assaulted and arrested in droves, and the 1968 Democratic National Convention would culminate in a night of televised police-on-protester violence in downtown Chicago. During the so-called Battle of Michigan Avenue, over 500 protesters were arrested. 100 protesters and 119 police officers were injured. The violence in the streets reflected a growing rift inside the Democratic Party between its radical and establishment wings. And in the 1972 contest, that rift would again rear its head. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Election's Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free, like Wild West Extravaganza, a journey back to the fascinating, tumultuous, and often violent world of the American Old West. From famous outlaws like Billy the Kid and Jesse James, to lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, to trailblazing pioneers and frontiersmen, Wild West Extravaganza tells the true stories of the real-life characters who shaped this iconic era. So saddle up and discover the true history of the American frontier, the good, the bad, and the ugly, ad-free at intohistory.com.
Hey, it's Jeremy from the new show American Criminal, and I'm popping in to tell you about another great show, Disgraceland. Disgraceland is an award-winning podcast that uniquely blends music, pop culture, and true crime with deeply researched storytelling and cinematic sound design. Host Jake Brennan tells the insane stories of musicians getting away with murder and behaving very badly. Stories about Jerry Lee Lewis, The Grateful Dead, Cardi B, Jay-Z, Jane's Addiction, Bruce Springsteen, Wu-Tang Clan, AC/DC, and so many more. Now, in 2024, after 6 years as the most downloaded music podcast in the world, Disgraceland is expanding to include stories from beyond the world of music. Stories of authors, artists, actors, athletes, true icons who possess dangerously compelling rock and roll hearts. New episodes now out on Anthony Bourdain, Andy Warhol, Peter Tosh, and Hunter S. Thompson. Episodes coming soon on Kobe Bryant, Bob Dylan, Basquiat, Jose Canseco, Van Halen, Bobby Brown, Garth Brooks, Chris Cornell, and more. Full episodes of Disgraceland are released every Tuesday with bonus after-party episodes released every Thursday. Check out Disgraceland on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, CastBox, or your favorite podcast app.
From Airship, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is American Election's Wicked Game. For the Democrats and for the nation, the 1960s were a difficult decade riddled with tension and tragedy. President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. His brother Bobby Kennedy was assassinated during the Democratic primary of 1968. The Cold War was still in full swing and turned red hot in Vietnam, where over 50,000 American troops would die in combat. The civil rights movement was left leaderless too. Just a month before Bobby Kennedy's assassination, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated as well in Memphis, Tennessee. After the tumultuous year of 1968, the Democratic Party was in shambles. In the face of widespread anti-war protests, President Johnson decided not to run in the 1968 contest. His vice president, Hubert Humphrey, won the Democratic nomination, even though the anti-war Democrat Eugene McCarthy had more popular support inside the party. The lack of enthusiasm for Humphrey was on full display in the 1968 general election. Humphrey lost to Republican Richard Nixon in an electoral landslide. The bad blood between the moderate and liberal wings of the Democratic Party would lead the DNC to create the McGovern-Fraser Commission, formerly known as the Commission on Party Structure and Delegate Selection. This commission would result in a new, ostensibly more democratic set of rules for the nomination process. Prior to 1968, presidential nominees were chosen by a combination of a small number of state primaries and a large delegate selection process at the national convention. But starting in 1972, the new rules for delegate selection put more weight on the primary process and effectively made the national convention a coronation. The beefed-up primary system would take power away from the party bosses, the mayors, union leaders, and local and state officials, and give it to the people. In the 1972 contest, for the first time in American history, the nominee of a major party would be decided in what President Richard Nixon called the fire of the primaries. These new rules, created by the McGovern-Fraser Commission, would spark a grassroots movement behind the candidacy of a liberal Democrat for whom the commission was partially named, South Dakota Senator George McGovern. Like Eugene McCarthy in 1968, McGovern would run in 72 on ending the Vietnam War, but the Democratic Party bosses would not accept McGovern without a fight. Throughout the 1972 campaign, McGovern would find himself caught in the political machinery of both major parties. This is episode 47, 1972, McGovern versus Nixon. Failure comes easy at times like this. It's July 1969 on Chappaquiddick Island in Edgartown, Massachusetts. Police Chief Dominic Jim Arena parks his cruiser on the side of the road next to the bulkhead of Dykes Bridge. The chief's been called to the scene of an automobile accident. Last night, a car reportedly went off the side of the bridge and crashed into the pond below. Chief Arena approaches two young fishermen, a young man and a high school kid, who stand on the side of the bridge and cast their rods. The chief calls out to them,
Their car over there?
No, sir, it's on the other side.
As the boy points in the opposite direction, the chief looks out over the water and finds what he's looking for: the rear tires of an automobile peeking up just over the surface of the water. As the chief takes in the scene, his eyes follow the scuff marks that show the car's path from the road, through the caplog barriers and into the pond below. The chief sees something else, too. A woman standing near the edge of the water. She waves up at him. He waves back before making his way down.
Hello, I'm Chief Arena. Mrs. Mom, I spoke to one of your colleagues on the phone. I live just down the way.
Earlier that morning, when the two fishermen spotted the car sticking out of the water, they knocked on Mrs. Mom's door to let her know. Mrs. Mom immediately called the police.
Now, you didn't see anything last night, correct? No, Chief. I heard a car pass by the house, though. And what time was that? Around midnight? It was going faster than normal for that bridge. Did you hear the car hit the water? No, sir.
The chief looks at the car, then up at the boys fishing off the bridge, then back at Mrs. Mom.
Do you live here alone, ma'am? No, Chief, I live with my husband. This is an odd question, but does he have a bathing suit I can borrow? Well, sure, he's about your size. Come with me.
After changing into Mrs. Mom's husband's trunks, the chief wades out into the water. First, he notices the strength of the current. Then he notices the steep drop-off at the edge of the bank. To get to the car, he'll have to dive in. He calls out to the two young fishermen above.
Hey, boys, do either of you happen to have a mask I can use?
I think there's one. Hold on. Stay put, I'll get it.
The kid runs down from the bridge, climbs into a punt boat beached on the shore, and produces a face mask. He hands it to the chief.
Here you go. Thank you. Now, wish me luck.
Chief Arena wades out to the edge of the bank. He takes a deep breath and dives into the water. Chief Arena fought his way through the strong current to get to the front seat of the submerged car. No sooner had he reached it than he was forced to come up for air. When backup finally arrived, the chief's team did a proper dive with scuba equipment. The driver's seat of the car was empty, but in the passenger seat was the body of a drowned woman. A subsequent investigation would reveal that the woman, Mary Jo Chappaquiddick, was a former staffer for the 1968 presidential campaign of the late Bobby Kennedy. But the most startling discovery made by Chief Arena was that the overturned car was registered to Bobby's brother, Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy. Further investigation revealed that Kennedy was driving drunk, with Chappaquiddick in the passenger seat. Kennedy made a wrong turn onto a dirt road leading to a one-way bridge. His car skidded off the bridge and into the pond. Kennedy claimed that he tried to rescue Chappaquiddick but was unsuccessful. Kennedy pleaded guilty to fleeing from the scene of an accident. He got off light, with a suspended jail sentence. But the nearly constant media coverage of the event ultimately influenced his decision not to run for president in 1972. Kennedy was perhaps the Democratic establishment's candidate of choice, but the Chappaquiddick incident, as it came to be called, made Kennedy's candidacy all but impossible. Kennedy's absence from the race made room for a host of well-qualified Democratic hopefuls. Maine Senator Ed Muskie, former Vice President Hubert Humphrey again, and New York Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman elected to Congress, among others. But out of the crowded field, the breakout star of the primaries was arguably the liberal, anti-war senator from South Dakota, George McGovern. McGovern was a quiet man, a scholar. While serving as a pilot during the Second World War, he had resolved that if he survived, he would go on to become a history professor. He earned his doctorate in history while performing ministerial work in the Methodist tradition. By 1972, Senator McGovern was staunchly anti-war. His position on Vietnam had evolved over the years. McGovern had voted for the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which allowed President Johnson to deploy conventional military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. But as time went on, he grew vocal in his opposition to the war. He drafted the McGovern-Hatfield Amendment in 1970, attached to an appropriations bill, which was informally called the Amendment to End the War. McGovern said on the Senate floor, "It does not take any courage at all for a congressman or a senator or a president to wrap himself in the flag and say we are staying in Vietnam, because it is not our blood that is being shed." But the McGovern-Hatfield Amendment was defeated. As a result, McGovern became convinced that the best way to end the war would be from inside the White House. But his candidacy was a long shot. With Ted Kennedy out of the race, the Democratic establishment had someone else in mind: Maine Senator Ed Muskie. Conventional wisdom held that Senator Muskie was the natural choice for the Democratic nomination. He had been former Vice President Hubert Humphrey's running mate in the 1968 election. And like Humphrey, Muskie occupied the center lane of the party. He had established himself as a seasoned statesman, one who could reach across the aisle and work with the Republican Party. But there were questions surrounding his position on the Vietnam War. At the 1968 Democratic Convention, Muskie had actively defended President Johnson's position on the war, which was one of continued American presence in the region. Muskie's defense of Johnson's policies sparked outrage, both from the public and from his liberal anti-war colleagues within the party. So despite Muskie's later opposition to the war, the memory of the 1968 convention still dogged him. Hours after Muskie announced his 1972 candidacy, Eugene McCarthy, the leading anti-war candidate in '68, announced that he would hold Muskie to a measure of personal responsibility for supporting Johnson's Vietnam policy at the '68 convention. In January of 1972, Muskie held a press conference, announcing he would gladly answer not only for the things I did right, but for the mistakes that I also acknowledge. Muskie hoped to carve out a very specific position: the practical anti-war candidate, a sensible, moderate Democrat who could beat Nixon without resorting to radicalism. At the outset of the race, it seemed Muskie's message was hitting home. The first primary contest came on January 24, 1972, with the Iowa caucus. The moderate Muskie came in first. The liberal George McGovern was close on his heels, though. To win the second contest in New Hampshire and solidify his status as the frontrunner, Muskie needed to win big. And indeed, he was projected to take New Hampshire in a landslide. But his goals in the Granite State were nearly thwarted by a media quagmire. The Manchester Union Leader was New Hampshire's largest and most influential newspaper. It was run by conservative editor William Loeb III. Loeb was a leading conservative voice, and he often used the Union Leader as a platform to attack his ideological opponents. On February 24, 1972, the Union Leader pushed a letter from a man named Paul Morrison, who claimed to have met Muskie at an event in Florida. Muskie was a Maine senator, and Maine was a very white state. According to Morrison, when Muskie was asked on the campaign trail how he could relate to the problems of Black Americans, one of Muskie's aides responded with a crude joke: "Not blacks, but we have Canucks." Canuck was an offensive term for Americans of French-Canadian descent. The joke was also insensitive to Black Americans. Allegedly, upon hearing his staffer's flippant joke, Senator Muskie laughed. The Union Leader story had the potential to tarnish Muskie's image as a dignified moderate who could counter Nixon's divisive rhetoric, and it could hurt Muskie's chances among New Hampshire's sizable French-Canadian community. Soon after, the Union Leader doubled down, publishing an attack on Muskie's wife, Jane Gray Muskie. The Union Leader claimed that while on the campaign tour, Jane drank and smoked to excess, that she used foul language and frequently told off-color jokes. On February 26, Muskie delivered a public address condemning William Loeb.
By attacking me, by attacking my wife, he has proved himself to be a gutless coward. I hope that the people of Manchester find a way to say that they don't like his kind of journalism here in New Hampshire, and that they say it in a way that they can make it stick. That's the only way he'll understand that here in northern New England, we respect each other. That's something I don't extend to him.
Muskie was visibly overcome as he defended his wife Jane. While he spoke, he wiped something from under his eye. In what would become campaign legend, the Washington Post reported that Muskie condemned Loeb's attacks with tears streaming down his face and his voice choked with emotion. Muskie denied he was crying. He insisted that he was wiping melted snow from his face, but it didn't matter. The press amplified the Washington Post story far and wide. The crying speech, as it came to be known, all but derailed Muskie's campaign. He'd been projected to win New Hampshire in a landslide. Instead, he eked out the narrowest victory. Again, McGovern was close on his heels. The New Hampshire primary was the beginning of the end for Senator Ed Muskie. After a string of crushing losses, he would eventually drop out on April 27th. But moderate Democrats who might have supported Muskie did not flock to the candidacy of George McGovern. Many looked to the same man the Democrats had put forth in 1968, former Vice President Hubert Humphrey. It might be said that Humphrey's experience serving as President Johnson's vice president was both his biggest asset and his biggest liability. Humphrey's moderate approach to politics still had appeal with many urban working-class voters, but his connection to LBJ, and by extension the Vietnam War, angered many liberals. Humphrey's entrance into the race only served to push liberal Democrats even further into the McGovern camp. The McGovern campaign was, in a sense, a political movement, a grassroots effort backed by an army of thousands of young, enthusiastic volunteers mobilizing all around the country. These liberal Democrats were largely students and suburban voters, and they flocked to the McGovern camp in droves. But to win the Democratic nomination and top Hubert Humphrey, McGovern needed to win over the core of Humphrey's supporters, blue-collar workers. In the Wisconsin primary, 2 weeks after Florida, the McGovern campaign modified its strategy and zeroed in on Humphrey's base. McGovern and his army of supporters canvassed the state, going door to door and making their pitch to the workers of Wisconsin. Hubert Humphrey was business as usual in Washington. McGovern was the candidate of the American worker. The change in messaging had an immediate impact. Despite predictions that Humphrey would run away with the Wisconsin contest, McGovern beat him by almost 10 percentage points. After Wisconsin, McGovern's path to the nomination seemed not only possible, but likely. He had already overtaken one moderate candidate and looked poised to take down another. But in the final stretch of the 1972 primary, with Muskie out and Humphrey on the ropes, the Democratic Party machine would not go down without a fight. If you're a careful Wicked Game listener, you know in the credits I mentioned my friend Professor Greg Jackson and his podcast, History That Doesn't Suck. It's a great show. But one way it can doesn't suck even more is when you listen to it without ads. You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game, all episodes of History That Doesn't Suck, and all episodes of many more great history podcasts without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. History That Doesn't Suck is a deeply researched chronological survey of American history from a trained academic who also knows how to tell a story. Plus, in addition to ad-free listening to one of the best American history podcasts out there, you get scores of bonus episodes at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. Tired of ads and promos like these? Want to skip ahead to newer elections? You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. But not only that, you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free. That includes the American Revolution podcast, a deep and thorough investigation of the times, people, and politics behind America's fight for independence. Also, the battles, because we can't start a new American nation without guns. And the American Revolution podcast tells the story of the revolution from beginning to end, from its origins in the French and Indian War, through the war itself, and on to the founding of the United States. Get American Elections Wicked Game, the American Revolutions podcast, and many others ad-free with bonus content at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. As the McGovern campaign picked up steam, the Humphrey campaign grew increasingly concerned. The upset victory in Wisconsin had proven that McGovern's liberal, grassroots message was a recipe for success. So for Humphrey to have a fighting chance, his campaign would have to make a stand. They would do it in the Nebraska primary. If McGovern's greatest strength was his liberal bona fides, many Democratic Party insiders wagered that his liberalism was also his greatest weakness, especially with the many Catholic voters in Nebraska. If these Middle American Christians could be convinced that McGovern was too liberal, they might abandon McGovern and back Humphrey. In April of 1972, in the run-up to the Nebraska primary, an unnamed Democratic senator anonymously told a member of the press, The people don't know McGovern is for amnesty, abortion, and the legalization of pot. This explosive quote was published by Robert Novak, a noted conservative journalist and McGovern critic. The quote spread quickly, and like a game of telephone, the phrase morphed along the way. If elected, or so the line went, the radically liberal George McGovern would push for acid, amnesty, and abortion. The phrase would stick around throughout the entire election, and it would take on many different forms. Based on McGovern's staunch opposition to the Vietnam War, acid, amnesty, and abortion eventually became acid, amnesty, and appeasement. The quote was, of course, a mischaracterization of McGovern's position. McGovern had supported amnesty for citizens who had dodged the Vietnam draft. He did not support the legalization of marijuana, only its decriminalization. And he wasn't exactly pro-choice either. McGovern thought abortion was an issue best left to the individual states. Still, the criticism that McGovern was too liberal seemed to stick, and it made the McGovern campaign nervous. So nervous, in fact, that on May 9th, the day of the Nebraska primary, the McGovern campaign tried to mount a defense. At a campaign event in Omaha, former Nebraska governor and McGovern supporter Frank Morrison attempted to ease the people's fears and break down the nuance of McGovern's positions. He told the crowd, "They say that George McGovern is for the legalization of marijuana, but I say..." Morrison didn't get to finish his sentence. Upon hearing the phrase legalization of marijuana, the crowd went wild with cheers and applause. When Morrison had a chance to speak again, he tried to clarify, "I tell you that George McGovern does not advocate the legalization of marijuana." At this, the crowd was audibly disappointed, but the governor continued, "They say George McGovern is for abortion on demand, but I tell you..." And again, the crowd burst into applause. Morrison tried to press forward, saying, "But I say to you that George McGovern is against tampering with our state laws on abortion." Again, the crowd was audibly disappointed. After the rally, Morrison said to McGovern, "George, maybe I'm too old to understand this new generation. I'll get the oldsters for you, and you take care of the young ones as you think best." And so the Humphrey campaign's plan to paint McGovern as a radical liberal backfired. Nebraska Democrats weren't turned off by McGovern's liberal views. In fact, it was just the opposite. McGovern won 16 of Nebraska's 22 delegates. Humphrey and the rest of the Democratic establishment were running out of options and running out of time. But McGovern wasn't Humphrey's only concern. There was another candidate in the race who gave moderates pause. This conservative Democrat had run for president twice before, as both a Democrat and an independent. Politically, he was to the right of both McGovern and Humphrey. He was the segregationist former governor of Alabama, George Wallace. Wallace had entered the 1972 race early on in the Florida primary. Florida was largely a pro-segregation state, and Wallace was the segregation candidate. In 1963, Wallace had famously declared that he was for segregation forever. Though Wallace eventually softened his rhetoric on segregation, his official axe to grind in 1972 was the issue of busing. Even though the Civil Rights Act of 1964 gave the federal government the authority to enforce desegregation, schools across America were still unofficially racially segregated. One of the solutions to this problem was busing, a policy whereby children would ride buses to schools outside their immediate neighborhoods. Children from majority black neighborhoods would attend schools in majority white neighborhoods, and vice versa. A 1971 Supreme Court ruling, Swan v. Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education, held that busing was constitutional. Still, many Southerners argued that busing was an infringement on states' rights. At a campaign event in St. Petersburg, Florida, in February 1972, Wallace had called that ruling senseless, asinine, and atrocious. Who do the children belong to, he asked. Not to the government, but to the good citizens of Florida. Wallace's message had worked. He had swept the primary with 42% of the vote. And throughout the primaries, Wallace generally maintained a steady third place, making him no small threat to Hubert Humphrey's prospects. If Wallace stole the Southern vote from Humphrey, it would only serve to help George McGovern. But in May of 1972, at a political rally in Maryland, an act of violence would turn the three-way primary into a two-man race. It's May 15, 1972, at a George Wallace campaign rally in Laurel, Maryland. Two off-duty police officers dressed in plain clothes walk through the parking lot of a local shopping center. As the two officers, Steve Watkins and David Mitchell, weave their way through the crowd, a peculiar-looking man catches Officer Mitchell's eye. He's young, thin, with blonde hair and a big grin on his face. He's dressed in red, white, and blue with sunglasses over his eyes and Wallace for President buttons pinned to his shirt. When their eyes meet, the man calls out to Mitchell.
Hey, buddy.
I've got a ton of Wallace buttons here. You want to buy one?
None for me, thanks. Just passing through.
You sure? This is a piece of history you're looking at. Wallace is going to be the President of the United States. You wouldn't want to miss out on that.
Sorry, no, I'm good. Wallace doesn't got it.
It's your loss, pal.
As the man continues hawking his buttons, Mitchell and Watkins continue walking. They find a place to stand about 50 feet from the stage. As Wallace takes the stage to make a speech, the crowd goes wild. But David Mitchell isn't interested in hearing what Wallace has to say. Tell you what, Steve, these Wallace people are something else. You're not a fan? Nope, can't get behind it. You look up racist in the dictionary, there's a picture of George Wallace. He's proud of it. Yeah, but what about your folks, Dave? Well, my grandfather hated everyone. Not me, though. I went to integrated school, so I guess I don't see the problem with all, the civil rights stuff. Wallace is crazy. David begrudgingly listens to Wallace's speech. After, he watches as the candidate steps off the stage and makes his way down a receiving line, shaking hands with his many fans in the crowd. You want to shake his hand? No. Come on, let's get out of here. But before the two officers have a chance to leave, gunshots ring out. Without hesitation, Officer Mitchell pulls out his badge, pins it to his jacket, and runs into the crowd. First, Mitchell sees George Wallace writhing in agony. Then he sees a swarm of Wallace supporters and police trying to get their hands on the shooter, the peculiar man who tried to sell Mitchell a Wallace button. The would-be assassin Arthur Brimmer had been living out of his car and following George Wallace since March. Brimmer kept a diary in which he announced his intention to kill either George Wallace or Richard Nixon. Brimmer ultimately decided that President Nixon's round-the-clock security detail was too much of a hurdle, so he focused his attention on Wallace. In a letter written decades later, Brimmer would rationalize his actions, saying that shooting segregationist dinosaurs was not as bad as shooting mainstream politicians. Wallace survived the shooting, but partially paralyzed, he would spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. The shooting was the end of Wallace's 1972 campaign. But if moderate Democrats were hoping that Wallace's departure from the race would open things up for Hubert Humphrey, they would be sorely disappointed. Going into the California primary, McGovern was in the lead with 560 delegates. Humphrey lagged behind with 311. California was a winner-take-all state. If Humphrey won the popular vote even by a small margin, he would win all of California's 271 delegates and take the lead. In the lead-up to the California primary in June of 1972, Humphrey and McGovern traded blows in front of the press. Recalling Humphrey's failed attempt at winning the White House 4 years earlier, McGovern said, "The people of this country are tired of politics as usual, and above all else, they do not want a rerun of 1968. Humphrey attacked McGovern's plans to trim the defense budget, cut troop strength overseas, and grant amnesty to draft evaders. McGovern and Humphrey then faced off in a series of 3 televised head-to-head debates. As the New York Times reported, Mr. Humphrey attacked Mr. McGovern's welfare programs and plans to cut the defense budget. Mr. McGovern attacked Mr. Humphrey's assertion that the Minnesotan had opposed the war in Vietnam in terms similar to those of Mr. McGovern. It was arguably the issue of Vietnam that decided the California primary. In the debates, McGovern hit Humphrey hard, saying that as late as 1967, Senator Humphrey was saying Vietnam is our greatest adventure and a wonderful one it is. In the minds of many Americans, Humphrey was tied to Vietnam and to the failed policies of the Johnson administration. McGovern, by contrast, proposed a new path forward, advocating a $23 billion reduction in the military's budget. He argued that the money the government was spending on the war was better spent on the domestic front. McGovern won California, taking all 271 delegates. That same month, he won New Mexico, South Dakota, and New York. The massive delegate haul knocked Humphrey out, and it pushed McGovern over the top. At the 1972 Democratic National Convention, some Democratic Party insiders formed a Stop McGovern bloc, but it was a limp effort. The new rules and delegate selection meant that the bulk of the delegates were already declared and decided, making the 1972 Democratic Convention a fait accompli. George McGovern won the Democratic nomination on the first ballot. In his acceptance speech, McGovern used Nixon's words against him.
He is the unwitting unifier and the fundamental issue of this national campaign. And all of us are going to help him redeem a pledge he made 10 years ago that next year you won't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore.
The crowd flew to its feet and cheered. McGovern promised that his presidency would be like his campaign, open and fueled by the people. And he promised that he would bring an end to America's involvement in the Vietnam War.
I am here as your candidate tonight, in large part because during 4 administrations of both parties, a terrible war has been charted behind closed doors. I want those doors opened, and I want that war closed.
He ended his speech on a powerful theme, that America had gone astray, was lost in war and deception and financial recklessness and ruin, and that it had to come home.
Come home to the affirmation that we have a dream. Come home to the conviction that we can move our country forward. Come home to the belief that we can seek a newer world. And let us be joyful in the homecoming. For this land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me.
The new primary system was not the only big change in 1972. The Democratic Party also adopted a convention quota for minority representation. The old party bosses would no longer be calling the shots alone. The quota gave more of a voice to people of color. The party was changing, and the 1972 Democratic platform was a resounding endorsement of McGovern's liberalism. The platform called for an end to the Vietnam War. It demanded amnesty for citizens who dodged the draft. It pushed for busing and desegregation. It sought to ban the sale of handguns. The platform also championed the rights of Americans to make their own choices of lifestyles and private habits without being subject to discrimination. Liberal Democrats were galvanized. Many moderate and conservative Democrats were alarmed. They feared the platform was an endorsement of immorality, drug use, and sexual promiscuity. And they feared it would hand the election to incumbent Republican President Richard Nixon. To beat Nixon, McGovern needed to unite his party. To do that, he needed to bring the moderates on board. The key would be selecting a vice president who would unite the two factions. McGovern considered a multitude of options, from Connecticut Senator Abraham Ribicoff to Senator Ted Kennedy. He even offered the job to Hubert Humphrey, but all turned him down. In the end, McGovern's choice for VP was both strategic and ironic. The young Missouri Senator Thomas Eagleton had strong appeal with moderate voters. He was a Catholic and vocally anti-abortion, and he was an up-and-comer in the Democratic Party. But Eagleton was also the anonymous senator behind the, quote, abortion, amnesty, and the legalization of pot. Eagleton, a political moderate, was initially a Muskie supporter. Hoping to stop McGovern from winning the nomination, Eagleton had spoken to conservative journalist Robert Novak on the condition of anonymity. It would not be revealed that Eagleton was the source of the claim until 2007, shortly after his death. Had McGovern known Eagleton gave birth to the acid abortion and amnesty scandal, he might have selected a different running mate. And he might have spared his candidacy a world of trouble. Icebergs, jagged rocks and rocky straits, mutinies, misfortune, and broadside battles. There are more tales of the sea than survivors to tell them, but the podcast Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is doing a good job, and you can listen to all episodes of that podcast plus many others, including American Election's Wicked Game, without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is one of my favorites from last year, a podcast about the greatest mishaps, misfortune, and misadventures of the sea. You'll hear stories of corruption, greed, bad intentions, and just plain horrible decision-making that resulted in some of the worst maritime disasters from all over the world. And some of these are more recent than you think. All episodes are ad-free, including bonus content and more at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Election's Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also ad-free, like Her Half of History. Because even though Hillary Clinton may not have made history when she ran for president in 2016, there have always been women who seized power, spied for their country, created artistic masterpieces, even escaped slavery.
Her Half of History is perfect for all those who sat in history class and wondered, what were the women doing all this time? Because the answer is a lot. Get Her Half of History, Wicked Game, and many others ad-free at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com.
After the Democratic convention, McGovern took a week off to rest in South Dakota. During his short break, a sudden revelation about Senator Eagleton's medical history put McGovern's campaign in a media tangle. Just days after the convention, Thomas Eagleton told the press he suffered from depression, saying, "On 3 occasions in my life, I have voluntarily gone into hospitals as a result of nervous exhaustion and fatigue." This admission was a problem for party insiders and voters alike. As vice president, Eagleton could end up with his finger on the nuclear button. In the minds of many, his depression made him unfit for the office. In face of mounting pressure from many Democratic Party leaders, Eagleton offered to step down. Publicly, McGovern stood by his vice presidential pick, saying that he was 1,000% behind him. Privately, though, McGovern was concerned. He soon began dropping hints that Eagleton might not be his running mate after all. McGovern cryptically told the Washington Post that the matter needed a proper period of consideration. Just under 3 weeks after he was selected as McGovern's running mate, Thomas Eagleton suddenly stepped down. He was replaced days later by Sergeant Shriver, the founder of the Peace Corps. In the eyes of many Americans, McGovern's sudden reversal made him look indecisive, amateurish, and weak, qualities unbefitting the office of the presidency. McGovern's about-face spelled disaster for his campaign. It gave his political enemies in the Republican Party ammunition against him, and it gave Richard Nixon an opportunity to strike. It's July 28, 1972, at the Burning Tree Clubhouse just outside of Washington, D.C. It's dusk. Nixon sits with 2 members of his cabinet, Treasury Secretary George Shultz and Secretary of State Bill Rogers. They've just played a round of golf with a very powerful Democrat, George Meany, the chairman of the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations. As the sun sets, the 4 men sit down for a drink and a cigar. For Nixon and his secretaries, this meeting is all business. It's no secret George Meany is not fond of George McGovern, but Nixon needs to know if he can count on the support of Chairman Meany and his union. But in this meeting, Nixon hasn't had a chance to get a word in. Meany, the old Democratic Party boss, is on a roll, sermonizing on the election.
Eagleton should have told McGovern all about the electrotherapy earlier, but McGovern handled it like a fool. Vacillating from one side to the other makes him look indecisive, weak. There's no doubt McGovern's going to lose in a landslide.
Nixon listens as Shultz forces his way into the conversation.
That's a bold prediction, George. You really think so? Who does McGovern got outside of students, Shultz? This election is a battle between the old guard and the new politics, all these young people and anti-war long hairs. McGovern's got workers, meaning he's got rank-and-file workers. That's what happened in Wisconsin and Massachusetts. Ohio, too. Yes, I'm well aware. It's quite obvious that there are divisions among the rank and file, Mr. Shultz. Let them vote how they please.
Sensing an opening, Nixon gets to the heart of the issue.
Well, now tell me, George, how do the union men feel about voting Nixon? Well, I'll be frank, they disagree with some of your policies, Dick. It's in labor's best interest to remain neutral in the presidential race and concentrate on the Senate and the House. But I'll tell you this much, we aren't going to pour money into McGovern's campaign. We'd rather throw it in the garbage.
It's not exactly the assurance Nixon wants to hear, but it's better than nothing. At the end of the evening, as everyone walks to their cars, Meany slides up to Nixon and clears his throat to speak.
I want you to know right now, Dick, that I'm not going to vote for you, but I'm not going to vote for McGovern either. You'll be all right with the Meany family. Mrs. Meany will vote for you, so will 2 of my 3 girls. The other one, well, she'll just follow her old man and not vote for anybody.
There's a knowing smile between the 2 of them. Nixon feels compelled to speak.
It's very kind of you, George. Rest assured there's no hard feelings.
Then Meany places his hand on Nixon's shoulder. He looks Nixon straight in the eye.
Just so you don't get a swelled head about my wife voting for you. I want to tell you why. She don't like McGovern.
In his meeting with Nixon, George Meany made it clear that he would not get in Nixon's way in November. This was an important development. Historically, organized labor, a powerful political force, had thrown its weight behind the Democratic Party. But like Meany, some sections of labor felt that McGovern was too liberal. In some places like New York, this caused unions to support Nixon. In others, it led to only pragmatic union support for McGovern. For some union members, while McGovern wasn't ideal, 4 more years of Nixon's price and wage controls would be harmful to workers, and many pro-McGovern union members believed that fears about social progress on issues of race relations and equality were not a justifiable reason to support Nixon. As one pro-McGovern labor leader asked his fellow workers, "What moves you more, your prejudices or your pocketbook? If you maintain your prejudices, it will cost you money." But these divisions diluted organized labor as a political bloc, and that dilution worked to Nixon's benefit. He wouldn't have to worry about workers, white workers in particular, mounting a unified campaign for George McGovern. In the 1972 contest, many moderate Democrats abandoned McGovern. Some even defected to Richard Nixon. Treasury Secretary John Connally, the former governor of Texas, stepped down from the cabinet to form an organization called Democrats for Nixon. These defectors warned that McGovern would bankrupt the nation, squander America's military strength in Vietnam, and alienate the white working class. They claimed that McGovern wanted to turn the Democratic Party into an ideological machine closed to millions of Americans who had been the party's most loyal and steadfast members. These defections put McGovern in trouble. As the famous American journalist Hunter S. Thompson put it in September of 1972, "If the current polls are reliable, Nixon will be reelected by a huge majority of Americans who feel he is not only more honest and more trustworthy than George McGovern, but also more likely to end the war in Vietnam." Nixon did not mount an aggressive campaign. By minimizing his public appearances and keeping quiet, Nixon hoped that McGovern would dig his own grave. Nixon focused instead on the job of the presidency and hoped that his past achievements would do the talking. Nixon also hoped to benefit from a major shift in the electoral landscape, the lowering of the voting age. The Vietnam War era had yielded the slogan, "Old enough to serve, old enough to vote." Congress had passed the 26th Amendment in March of 1971. It was ratified months later on July 1st, officially lowering the voting age to 18. Additionally, the administration appeared to pursue a drawdown in Vietnam. On October 27th, 2 weeks before the election, Nixon's national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, delivered a press conference on the state of the conflict. He opened with a phrase that would become Nixon's Vietnam policy in the final days of his 72 campaign.
"We believe that peace is at hand."
Kissinger believed that the time for peace talks between the U.S. and the Vietnamese, both from the North and South, was at hand. The Nixon administration had drawn the ire of the Yippies and the anti-war camp for launching bombing campaigns in Laos and Cambodia. But with a potential end to the Vietnam War in sight, Nixon hoped to lay claim to the anti-war mantle. He viewed this as critical to winning the 1972 election, as he himself admitted in a secret meeting between himself and Kissinger.
And also due to the fact that as I look at the tide of history out there, South Vietnam probably never been surviving.
Nixon says, "South Vietnam is probably never going to survive anyway. I'm just being perfectly candid. Kissinger interrupts. In the pullout arena, Nixon hops back in. "Well, there's got to be, if we can get certain guarantees so that they aren't, as you know, looking at the foreign policy process, though. I mean, you've got to be, we also have to realize, Henry, that winning an election is terribly important. It's terribly important this year." An American bombing campaign on North Vietnam would break out that December, proving that peace was not as close at hand as Kissinger had let on. But for the time being, it appeared as though McGovern had been outmaneuvered. The people wanted an end to the Vietnam War, and Nixon appeared to be the man who would deliver it. This helped Nixon secure half of the youth vote. On the election day, with the exception of one faithless elector who voted for a third party, Nixon won all electoral votes in 49 of 50 states. McGovern only won Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. Nixon's nearly 61% of the popular vote was the largest percentage ever enjoyed by a Republican up to that point in history. In the 1972 campaign, Nixon doubled down on his strategy from 1968. Nixon's Southern strategy appealed to white Southern voters who were deeply anxious about the liberalism of men like George McGovern. After the attempted assassination of George Wallace in May, this voting bloc largely flocked to Richard Nixon. In 1972, Nixon succeeded in finally wresting away the Democratic Party's grip on the reins of the Southern voter, a reliable Democratic voting bloc since the days of Reconstruction. But there was another crucial factor in Nixon's victory. In 1970, members of the Nixon administration had formed the Committee to Re-elect the President, or the CRP. CREEP, as it was sometimes called, used its war chest of hundreds of thousands of dollars to take extraordinary and often illegal measures to ensure Nixon's re-election. An FBI investigation in October of 1972 revealed that the Canuck letter sent to the Manchester Union leader in February of that year, alleging that Ed Muskie laughed at an offensive joke, was the work of the committee to re-elect the president. But the most audacious dirty trick CREEP pulled was not a forged letter. It was an illegal break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in Washington, D.C.'s Watergate Hotel. Though the Watergate break-in was front-page news in the summer of 1972, the true depth of the scandal was still unknown. McGovern had tried to use the break-in to hurt Nixon, calling it the kind of thing you'd expect under a person like Hitler. But Nixon had denied any involvement by the White House, writing it off as a third-rate burglary. In the short term, Nixon's attempts to distance himself from the Watergate scandal had worked. But shortly after the election, Watergate would explode. The scandal would bring the Nixon administration to its knees. It would put the president in the crosshairs of justice, and it would have a titanic impact on the 1976 election. This is episode 47 of American Elections Wicked Game, 1972. Failure comes easy at times like this. On the next episode, the election of 1976. After Nixon is caught up in arguably the biggest presidential scandal in American history, he enlists the help of a man with unimpeachable character, Gerald R. Ford Jr. In the wake of Watergate, Ford becomes the only man to ever be appointed to the presidency. In his re-election for an office he was never elected to, Ford must prove himself worthy of nomination and fight off a Washington outsider, Georgia Democrat Jimmy Carter. This episode contains reenactments and dramatized details, and while in most cases we can't know exactly what was said, all our dramatizations are based on historical research. American Elections Wicked Game is an Airship production, hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham. Audio editing by Molly Bach. Sound design by Derek Behrens. Music by Lindsey Graham. Co-executive produced by Stephen Walters in association with Ritual Productions. Written and researched by Dante Flores and Stephen Walters. Fact-checking by Greg Jackson and C.L. Salazar from the podcast History That Doesn't Suck.
At the beginning of the 20th century, few people were interested in adopting children. One woman wanted to change that. Georgia Tann knew that orphan children just needed a second chance at life with a loving family. The problem was that she wasn't always willing to wait for children to enter the system in the usual ways, so she started stealing them. Hey, I'm Jeremy Schwartz, host of the new true crime history podcast, American Criminal. We take you inside the minds of some of our most notorious felons and outlaws, exploring the dark side to the American dream. In our latest season, how one woman steered the creation of the modern adoption industry and made herself incredibly wealthy in the process. Listen to American Criminal Georgia Tann wherever you get your podcast. Or to get early ad-free access to the entire season first, plus hundreds of other ad-free history podcast episodes, subscribe at IntoHistory.com.